At 44, Claire Bennett stood outside her apartment with her entire life packed into 3 worn suitcases. The lock had been changed. A white notice was taped neatly to the door, informing her that she had been evicted after failing to pay rent for 2 months. Claire read it twice, even though every word was painfully clear. She had $187 left in her bank account. Her old car had barely enough fuel for one more trip. The company where she had worked for 16 years had closed 3 weeks earlier. Her marriage had ended only months before that, leaving behind unpaid bills and a silence she still did not know how to face. She did not call her friends. She did not call her ex-husband. Instead, Claire sat behind the steering wheel, looked at the 3 suitcases in the back seat, and remembered the one place she had spent nearly 20 years trying to forget: her father's farm. It stood 4 hours from the city, at the end of a dirt road outside the small town of Bellwether. No one had cared for it since her father died. The fields had gone wild, the roof was beginning to rot, and the old barn leaned to one side as though the next strong wind might bring it down. Claire could have sold the property years ago, but every time the real estate agent called, she delayed. Perhaps she had been too busy. Perhaps the land was worth so little that signing the papers hardly seemed worthwhile. Or perhaps selling it would mean admitting that her father was truly gone. That afternoon, Claire left the city without looking back. By the time she reached Bellwether, the sun was sinking behind the hills. Weeds had swallowed much of the road leading to the farm. Sections of the wooden fence had collapsed, and the farmhouse stood in complete darkness. Claire turned off the engine. There were no voices, no lights, only the wind passing through the loose boards of the barn in the distance. She stepped out, pulled her coat tightly around herself, and stared at the ruined property. "Only a few days," she whispered, "until I find somewhere else." But as Claire pushed the old key into the farmhouse door, she had no idea that the farm was more than the last place she had left to go. It was also hiding a secret her father had buried many years before. Claire woke before sunrise to the sound of rain dripping through the ceiling. A dark stain had spread across the bedroom plaster during the night. In the kitchen, one window was cracked, the pipes coughed rusty water, and the refrigerator had stopped working years ago. She found an old bucket beneath the sink and placed it under the leak. In daylight, the farm looked worse than she remembered. Thistles covered the fields, several fence posts had fallen, and the soil near the farmhouse was dry and split into hard plates. The orchard her father once cared for had become a maze of dead branches and tangled vines. At the far end of the property stood the barn. Its faded red boards had turned gray, part of the roof had collapsed, and one of the large wooden doors leaned crookedly against its frame. Claire stared at it for a moment, remembering how her father had forbidden her from playing inside as a child. Before she could walk closer, a pickup truck appeared on the dirt road. The driver was Walter Hayes, an elderly farmer who owned the neighboring property. He stepped out slowly, removed his cap, and looked at Claire with surprise. "I heard someone came up the road last night," he said. "Didn't expect it to be you." Claire forced a smile. "I'm only staying temporarily." Walter looked across the neglected fields. "Your father tried to keep this place alive longer than anyone thought possible, but the well is nearly dry, and that soil hasn't produced much in years." His words were not cruel, but they carried the certainty of a verdict. Later that morning, Claire called the real estate agent whose messages she had ignored for years. By noon, a polished black car pulled into the yard. The agent inspected the house, photographed the broken fences, and walked only a few steps into the field before returning. "The structure needs extensive repairs," he said. "There's no reliable water source, and buyers won't pay for land they can't farm." "How much is it worth?" Claire asked. The figure he gave her was barely enough to cover her debts. "You should take whatever offer comes," he advised. "Otherwise, this place will keep costing you money." After he left, Claire stood alone in the yard. The farm had been her father's entire life. Yet to the agent, the neighbors, and perhaps everyone in Bellwether, it was nothing more than exhausted soil and rotting wood. A property with no future. Then a gust of wind swept across the yard. The old barn door moved with a deep wooden groan, swung open several inches, and slammed shut again. Claire turned toward it. For the first time, she noticed something strange. Although the door was hanging crookedly, its lower edge did not scrape across the ground. It struck something hidden beneath the soil. The next morning, Claire carried a hammer, a shovel, and a can of oil across the yard. She told herself she was only going to fix the barn door before another storm arrived. The door was too heavy to leave swinging in the wind, and if it tore free from its hinges, she could not afford to replace it. Up close, the barn looked even more fragile. Rain had darkened the wooden walls, moss covered the lower boards, and several nails had worked loose from the frame. Claire pushed the door open with both hands. It moved slowly, groaning against the rusted hinges. When she tried to close it, the lower corner stopped several inches before reaching the frame. She pushed harder. The door struck something beneath the soil with a dull metallic sound. Claire knelt and scraped away the mud with the shovel. At first, she uncovered only stones and tangled roots. Then the blade hit iron. She cleared a wider circle and found a thick metal ring lying flat in the ground. It was not attached to the barn door. It had been fastened to a square wooden panel, buried beneath years of dirt. Claire pulled on the ring, but the panel did not move. She dug around its edges until she found two rusted hinges on one side. Someone had deliberately covered it with soil and built the barn threshold over part of it. A trapdoor. Her first thought was that it might lead to an old storm cellar. Farms in the region often had underground storage rooms, although she had never known this one existed. Claire wrapped both hands around the ring and pulled again. Nothing happened. She used the hammer to loosen the packed soil, then slid a piece of broken fence board beneath the edge as a lever. The wood creaked. The buried panel rose less than an inch before dropping back into place. A breath of cold air escaped through the gap. Claire froze. The air carried the smell of damp stone, old wood, and something faintly metallic. She pressed her ear close to the opening. At first, she heard only the wind moving through the barn. Then came another sound, a slow drop of water falling somewhere deep below. Claire looked toward the farmhouse, suddenly aware of how alone she was. She could cover the panel and walk away. Whatever her father had hidden beneath the barn had remained untouched for years. But beside the iron ring, beneath the last layer of mud, she noticed a small carving in the wood. 2 letters, CB, her initials. Claire spent nearly an hour clearing the remaining soil from the trapdoor. By the time she finished, her hands were blistered and the knees of her jeans were soaked with mud. She wedged the broken fence board beneath the edge once more and pushed down with all her weight. The panel lifted with a sharp crack. A cloud of dust rose from the opening. Beneath it, narrow stone steps descended into darkness. Claire found an old flashlight in the barn, struck it twice against her palm, and watched a weak yellow beam flicker to life. Then she lowered one foot onto the first step. The air grew colder as she descended. The walls were built from rough stones darkened by moisture. Roots had pushed through the gaps, and water dripped steadily somewhere ahead. After 12 steps, Claire reached a low underground room. Shelves lined both walls. Most had collapsed, but several glass jars remained upright beneath layers of dust. Inside them were seeds of different shapes and colors: beans, corn, squash, and flowers, each sealed with wax and marked in her father's handwriting. Some labels carried dates from more than 20 years earlier. On the floor nearby were rusted tools, coils of copper wire, clay pipes, and sections of old wooden guttering. None of it looked valuable, yet everything had been arranged with care. This was not a place her father had forgotten. It was a place he had prepared. At the back of the cellar stood a metal cabinet secured with a small padlock. Claire searched the nearby shelves and found a key hanging from a nail behind a cracked lantern. The lock opened easily. Inside the cabinet were rolled maps, several notebooks, and a rectangular steel box wrapped in oilcloth. Her pulse quickened when she lifted it. The box was heavier than she expected. Across the lid, scratched deeply into the metal, were the same initials she had seen on the trapdoor: CB. Claire placed the box on an old workbench and unwrapped the cloth. A thin layer of rust covered the hinges, but the latch still moved. Inside, she found no money, jewelry, or family documents. There was only a sealed envelope and a folded map. Her name was written across the envelope. Claire stared at the familiar handwriting. For Claire, when the farm has nowhere left to turn, she opened it carefully. The letter inside contained only one sentence. The barn door is not the secret. It is only where the secret begins. Claire unfolded the map beside the metal box. At first, it looked like an ordinary drawing of the farm. The house, barn, orchard, and northern field were all marked in her father's careful handwriting. But across the paper ran a series of blue lines that did not appear on any property map she remembered. One began near the wooded hill behind the farm. Another curved beneath the old orchard. They joined at a circle drawn directly under the barn. Beside it, her father had written, "The water did not disappear. We stopped listening to where it went." Claire opened the first notebook. Every page was filled with dates, rainfall measurements, sketches of tree roots, and observations about the land. Her father had recorded where frost melted first, where grass stayed green longest during drought, and where animals gathered in late summer. For years he had been searching for water, not by drilling deeper into the dry well, but by studying the farm itself. One entry described a spring that had once flowed from the hillside into a stone reservoir. According to her father, the system had supplied the farmhouse, orchard, and livestock troughs long before electric pumps were installed. Then, during a severe storm, part of the hillside collapsed. Mud and broken stone buried the upper channel. The water changed direction and vanished beneath the ground. Most people assumed the spring had dried up. Her father did not. Claire turned another page and found a detailed drawing of clay pipes, stone trenches, and wooden gates, designed to guide water downhill using gravity. Several sections were marked with red crosses. Blocked, crushed, unknown condition. At the bottom of the page was a final note. "I could not finish this alone. If Claire ever comes back, show her the old pear trees. Their roots remember the path." Claire stopped breathing for a moment. The old pear trees stood on the western edge of the orchard. She remembered them from childhood, 3 twisted trees that continued producing small, bitter fruit even during the driest summers. She opened the last notebook. A folded photograph slipped from between the pages. It showed her father standing beside the barn many years earlier. Behind him was a narrow stone channel filled with clear running water. On the back he had written, "One day, this farm may save her the way it once saved me." Claire sat alone in the cold cellar, holding the photograph with both hands. Her father had not buried money beneath the barn. He had buried a map to something the entire town believed no longer existed. And if his notes were right, the farm was not dying from a lack of water. The water was still there. It was simply trapped beneath the land. The following morning, Claire carried her father's map into the orchard. The 3 old pear trees stood exactly where he had marked them, twisted and hollow in places but still alive. Around them, the ground was noticeably darker than the rest of the field. Claire knelt and pressed her hand into the soil. It was cool. Only 50 yards away, the earth was dry enough to crumble into dust. She followed the blue line on the map toward the hill. Along the way, she began noticing signs her father had recorded. A strip of greener grass, moss growing on the shaded side of stones, and a shallow depression cutting across the slope. What looked random at first slowly formed a path. Near the edge of the woods, she found the remains of a stone channel buried beneath leaves and roots. Several sections had collapsed, but the direction matched the map. Walter arrived just before noon. Claire showed him the notebook and the exposed stones. He studied them in silence. "I remember a spring up here," he finally said. "Your father used to talk about reopening it. Most people thought he was chasing a memory. Did you?" Walter looked toward the dead orchard. "I thought he was too stubborn to accept that the land had changed." Together, they cleared the channel uphill. They found broken clay pipe beneath the soil, then a wooden gate swollen shut by years of moisture. Farther along, the trench disappeared beneath a mound of earth and fallen rock. Claire dug until her shoulders burned. By late afternoon, the shovel struck something solid. Stone. She widened the hole and uncovered the curved wall of an old reservoir. Its top had been buried under nearly 3 feet of soil. A rusted iron lid sat at the center. Walter helped her lift it. The chamber below was dark, but when Claire aimed her flashlight inside, the beam reflected off a shallow pool of water. Not much, barely a few inches, but it was clear. Claire stared at the reflection trembling below. Her father had been right. The spring had not vanished. A section of the old system had simply been buried and blocked. Then Walter pointed toward the far wall of the reservoir. A thin stream of water was still seeping through a crack between the stones, drop by drop. Year after year, Claire looked back at the dry orchard and understood what the map truly represented. It was not just a record of where the water had once flowed. It was a set of instructions for bringing the farm back to life. Claire spent the last of her savings on pipe, timber, sealant, and a rented excavator. For 3 days, she and Walter cleared the collapsed channel, replaced broken sections, and rebuilt the wooden gate beside the reservoir. By the 4th evening, water had begun moving through the upper trench. It was only a narrow stream, but Claire followed it downhill with growing hope. The water reached the orchard. Then the ground gave way. A buried section of the old channel collapsed beneath the pressure. Mud and water burst through the slope, tore across the yard, and rushed directly toward the barn. "Claire, move!" Walter shouted. They ran as the muddy current poured through the open doorway. Tools, crates, and seed jars floated across the floor. Claire reached the cellar entrance just as water spilled over the stone steps. She climbed down and grabbed the metal box first. Then she tried to save the seed jars. One shelf collapsed before she reached it. Glass shattered across the floor. Beans, corn, and squash seeds scattered into the muddy water. Labels written in her father's handwriting dissolved before her eyes. By midnight, the flow had slowed. The barn stood soaked and silent. Part of the cellar wall had cracked, the repaired channel was ruined, and most of the supplies Claire had purchased were buried beneath mud. Walter told her they could try again. Claire did not answer. The next morning, she opened her email and found a final notice from the bank. Her car payment was overdue. Her remaining credit had been frozen, and the real estate agent had sent another message. A buyer was prepared to make an immediate cash offer. Claire sat at the kitchen table with her father's map in front of her. She had followed his instructions. She had trusted the land, and the farm had rewarded her by destroying the last things she could afford to lose. That afternoon, she called the agent. "I'll sign," she said. He agreed to bring the papers the following morning. Before sunset, Claire walked to the orchard one final time. The old pear trees stood above the ruined channel, their branches black against the sky. She placed her hand on one trunk. "I'm sorry," she whispered, unsure whether she was speaking to the farm or to her father. Then she heard it. Not rain, not wind, water. Somewhere beneath the broken stones, a steady trickle was moving downhill. Claire followed the sound through the ruined orchard. She knelt beside the broken channel and pulled away loose stones with both hands. Beneath them, water was moving through a narrow gap in the soil. The collapse had not stopped the spring. It had opened a new path. Claire returned to the farmhouse, spread her father's map across the kitchen table, and studied the red marks again. Until then, she had focused on rebuilding the old system exactly as it had been. But one note in the margin changed everything. "Do not force water uphill. Let the land decide the route." Before sunrise, Claire went back outside with a shovel and a length of clear tubing. Instead of repairing the deepest section of the damaged trench, she dug a shallower path along the natural curve of the slope. Walter arrived as she was placing stones along its edges. "You're supposed to be signing papers this morning," he said. "I know. And if this fails?" Claire looked toward the farmhouse. "Then I'll sign them this afternoon." Together, they redirected the small stream away from the collapsed ground. Claire used stones from the old channel to slow the flow and prevent erosion. At each bend, the water settled, then continued downhill under its own weight. No electric pump, no expensive machinery, only gravity and the shape of the land. By mid-morning, the first trickle reached the old stone reservoir beside the orchard. Claire cleared the outlet her father had marked and watched the water move into a shallow ditch beneath the pear trees. The dry soil darkened almost instantly. A few minutes later, the agent's black car appeared on the road. He stepped into the yard carrying a folder of documents. Claire stood near the orchard, muddy from the knees down. "The buyer is ready," he called. "We only need your signature." She looked at the papers. Then she heard Walter behind her. "Claire." He was pointing toward the reservoir. The water level had risen above the stain marking its old bottom. It was still low, but no longer measured in drops. A steady stream was entering through the stone wall. Claire walked to the 3 pear trees. Near their roots, tiny green shoots had pushed through the damp soil, seeds awakened by the water released during the collapse. The land had given her its first answer. Claire turned toward the agent. "I'm not signing today." He stared at the broken barn, the muddy yard, and the thin ribbon of water. "You're refusing a cash offer because of that?" Claire looked down as the stream continued between her boots. "No," she said. "I'm refusing because this farm is not dead." Within 2 weeks, the stone reservoir was holding enough water to feed 3 irrigation channels. Claire repaired only the sections she could afford, using salvaged pipe, flat stones, and timber from the collapsed fence. Each morning, she opened the wooden gates by hand and watched water move slowly through the orchard. The changes were small at first. Grass returned around the pear trees. Buds appeared on branches Claire had assumed were dead. In the lower field, patches of green spread across soil that had remained brown for years. Walter brought her trays of vegetable seedlings. "You'll need proof before people believe you," he said. Claire planted beans, tomatoes, squash, and corn in narrow rows beside the restored channel. She also cleaned the remaining seed jars from the cellar and tested what had survived the flood. Many seeds failed. Some never opened, but a handful of old bean and squash varieties pushed through the soil. By late summer, Bellwether entered its driest season in decades. Neighboring wells dropped, lawns turned yellow, and several farms began hauling water in tanks. Claire's reservoir continued to fill. The spring was not powerful, but it was steady. Because the water traveled downhill by gravity, she did not need an expensive pump. She watered only the roots, covered the soil with straw, and reused overflow in a small pond near the lower field. Soon, people began stopping at the gate. They came to see the green orchard surrounded by dry land. A local restaurant owner bought Claire's first baskets of vegetables. Then a nursery asked for seeds from the surviving squash plants. Walter helped her rebuild the roadside stand her father once used. The same real estate agent returned in early autumn. This time, he did not remain beside his car. He walked through the orchard, examined the reservoir, and photographed the restored channels. 2 days later, he called Claire with a new valuation. The number was almost 4 times his original estimate. "There's a buyer willing to discuss development," he said. "With a reliable private water source, this land is worth considerably more." Claire looked across the field, where rows of vegetables stood beneath the afternoon sun. Months earlier, she would have accepted immediately. Now she understood what her father had known. The farm's greatest value was not the house, the barn, or even the acreage. It was the system hidden beneath them. "I'm not selling," she said. For years, everyone had measured the farm by what they could see above the ground. Her father had left Claire the truth below it. 1 year after Claire returned to the farm, the old barn door still leaned slightly to one side. She had repaired the hinges but left the weathered boards untouched. The faded wood, deep scratches, and rusted iron ring remained exactly as she had found them. By then, the farm no longer looked abandoned. The orchard had returned to life. The pear trees were producing fruit again. Vegetable rows covered the lower field, and the restored channels carried spring water beneath strips of green grass. Every Saturday, families from Bellwether stopped at the roadside stand. Some came for vegetables. Others came simply to see the farm everyone had once called worthless. Claire never told them the story as if she had performed a miracle. She explained that the water had always been there. Her father had noticed the signs, recorded them carefully, and preserved the knowledge until someone was ready to continue his work. That autumn, Walter helped her place a wooden table inside the repaired barn. On it, Claire displayed copies of her father's maps, Photographs of the restoration, and jars containing seeds descended from those found in the cellar. She invited local students and farmers to study how the old gravity-fed system worked. Above the table hung her father's final note. "The barn door is not the secret. It is only where the secret begins." Claire finally understood what he had meant. The real secret was not the cellar, the map, or even the hidden spring. It was the habit of looking closer when everyone else had already decided something was worthless. Her father had seen life beneath dry soil. He had seen direction in tree roots, memory in stone channels, and possibility in a farm the town had given up on. Claire had once believed returning there meant failure. Instead, the farm taught her that starting over did not always mean finding a new place. Sometimes it meant learning how to see an old place differently. One evening, Claire stood beside the barn as sunlight spread across the restored fields. Water moved quietly through the channel near her boots. She touched the old door and smiled. A year earlier, she had arrived with 3 suitcases, $187, and nowhere else to go. Now she had a home, a living farm, and a future built from the knowledge her father had protected for her. The door had opened because it could no longer close, and so had she.